galactic trader, the combined program.
But I mean, if you use
So,
big bars and then you press and get your aspects, what's it really telling you? Is it for the end of the month, that day, or is it for the whole month, or?
well, it depends on what you're looking at with the range of the bar. In other words, in some bars we're looking at the high or the low, whether it be a monthly bar, daily bar, weekly bar, you know, whatever time frame we're using, okay? And does the bar touch the planetary line at all along the bar? That's one point of importance.
When you press and you get that whole list of aspects, is it giving you the...
Ah, okay, okay, when you click on the bar there, right.
Is it giving you the aspects for the whole month?
No, no, it'll just do it, will it do it for the whole month?
Last day of the month?
I don't know, somebody got the program up, put up a monthly bar and click on that. I don't, right click on a price bar on a monthly chart. That's what his question is. I've not actually used that except on the daily bar to look at the aspects.
Well,
I understand your question, yeah, right. Right, I think it is. But that's something we need to look at. Have you had experience with that, Ted?
yeah, I'll demonstrate that when we start up again. We'll make it into some levels and start them.
Okay, yeah, just to see what does it list the aspects for the whole month when you right click on it, or just the day? I'm fine with it. Okay, yeah, that's, you know, I've got all this on PowerPoint, so I can't get it to the computer and play with it. Yes, Steve?
The keeper line seems to be getting tighter near the top. Is that, you know, whenever that happened with my brother, was that just because of the scale of the adjusted scale?
Right, exactly. Fran? Yeah.
That should did it for you. It defaults to the first day of the month, but on the other hand, you have that month button and aspects.
Okay. So when you right click on it on a monthly bar, it'll show you the aspect for the first day of the month, but then you can also go in and look at other days in the month manually. Okay. Right, right. So let's look at another type of chart here. This looks a whole lot like a Gann wheel, but it's not. It's a Bayer wheel. This is George Bayer's work. He did something more than just his work on first trade charts. This is what he called a five-fold horoscope, and he set this one up for the New York Stock Exchange. Bayer did some pretty weird stuff, and it's real interesting to look at. There are 5 different charts. He says you really can't understand what's going on in the markets with astrology unless you're looking at 5 different horoscopes simultaneously. And the first one is the first trade chart, which is the radix chart. When we talk about charts in combination in astrology, the first one is the root or the radix chart. And so that's the one that he begins with. Then after we have the radix, he uses a secondary progress chart, which is simply a day for a year progression. And we won't go into that because Bayer himself says, this one doesn't have a lot of credibility. I don't get a lot of useful information from it. Of all the ones that I'm using, this gives me the least useful stuff. But I use it anyway because sometimes you'll see something there. And then after the secondary progress chart, we have what he called a mundane horoscope, which is a chart set for 0 degrees Aries, the beginning of that whole cycle that we were looking at earlier, as the rising point for that chart. And everything is calibrated according to that 0 Aries point. He said this is very, very important. It's a significant thing that we need to pay attention to because it'll give you different information when you start to look at a horoscope in that way. And then he mirrored 2 of the charts. He took the first trade chart and calculated along the Cancer-Capricorn axis and set up what we might call solstice points or antisia. He called them mirror points. Now, these are a little different than the mirror points when we do the mirrored lines in the program, because those are mirrored along the Aries-Libra axis, okay, rather than the Cancer-Capricorn axis. So those are what we might call equinoctial or equinoctial mirrors. If we could say it, we'd talk about it more often, right? And then he did the same thing with the Aries chart, with the mundane chart. So he put them together, 5 of them all on one wheel, and working the way, in from the outside. The outermost one is the progress chart, probably because he considered it the least important. And then we have the first trade chart or the radix chart next, and then going inward the mundane or Aries chart, and then the radix mirrored and the mundane mirrored. This is how he set this up. Now, in one of his books is largely about how to construct this. It's very, very complex stuff. It'll rack your brain trying to do it. Unfortunately, there's not a computer program out there that can do all these calculations and combine this wheel. So it's very, very difficult to test the validity of Bayer's work in this area without doing a huge amount of manual labor. And then the conclusions that you're drawing from it are a little bit iffy. But there are certain weird things going on with Bayer's work at this point, and that's what I wanted to draw your attention to today. Because as he did this, he put an emphasis on symmetrical planetary arrangements. Where are things falling between other planets? And we're getting symmetrical arrangements of planets, what we might call planetary pictures. This recognition in his work of the Aries point, which in some astrological systems is known as the world point. If anything is going to happen in the external world in a significant way, then 0 degrees Aries needs to get involved in it. That's what some of the astrological knowledge says. And apparently Bayer was recognizing that as being especially applicable when we start working with stocks and commodities. And there's an emphasis in his work on the planets as active principles rather than the placement of planets in signs or houses. It's not like Mars in Cancer is going to do this and Mars in some other sign is going to do that, as much as it is it's taking action in a relationship with other planets. Now, all of these points that came out of his work are very, very similar to key tenets of what we might call the German symmetrical schools of astrology, which was being developed in the first half of the 20th century in Germany. Thanks to the Third Reich, a lot of it didn't make it into America until after World War II. A lot of the work was not translated and readily available until the 1960s. And there aren't many astrologers today who know about this work, but Bayer was born in Germany. And he talks in his writing about reading things in German in ancient German books on astrology. Now, we don't know whether he was veiling this information or whether he was actually corresponding with some of the guys in Hamburg. Don't have any idea. But the ideas that he was using were strikingly similar to these particular schools of astrology. We know them today as the Hamburg school, the Uranian astrologers, and the cosmobiologists. And in fact, if we look at this first trade, or this five-fold horoscope, rather, right here at the bottom, he says, I have invented and assumed planets. Invented and assumed planets. What the heck is he talking about by invented and assumed planets? I have inserted 4 additional signs in the radix horoscope that are carried out into the M, that's the mundane, and the radix mirrored and mundane mirrored horoscope also. I gave them special symbols. 1, an anchor. Another, a stick with a triangle on the top. The third, a line which has a fork on each side. And a fourth which has a ball with a line and a half moon above. These places bring forth changes in the trend of stocks just as if planets were there. This is what Bayer said. And he went on to say, the question is, are these unknown planets or not? For our part, we don't care, as long as they bring changes in the trend. One of the most unusual facets of this Uranian astrology that was developed in Germany is what we call the trans-Neptunian hypothetical planets. These are, in fact, planets that may or may not actually exist. And Bayer was talking about invented and assumed planets in his astrological work. I told you we were going to get out on a limb today. Okay. Now, these were 8 planets that were postulated by Alfred Witte and Friedrich Sigrun in the early part of the 20th century. That's Witte on the left. They have never been seen, but they do in fact have effects. And I have to confess to you here that I've read about this stuff, and it kind of stretched me to the limit a lot. Okay, it's like, wait a minute, what are we actually getting into here? And then I started seeing the evidence of this in George Bayer's work. My good friend Bill Meridian said, Tim, you've got to start looking at this stuff. It works. He's written a book on planetary stock trading, so okay, I'll pay attention to him. The late Charles Emerson was a very renowned astrologer. Talking with him, he said, you've got to be studying this stuff. So, as I reluctantly began to take a look at it, I discovered that, yeah, there is something going on here. The trans-Neptunian planets, or the TNPs, there are 8 of them. And they have funny-looking symbols and funny-looking names. We have Cupido and Hades and Zeus and Kronos and Apollon, Admetos, Volcanos, and Poseidon. They have not been observed. They may not exist at all. So what do we do with them anyway? Cupido and Hades are the closest to Earth, and they have elliptical orbits. Witte was an amazing individual, an engineer. He mapped out the Hamburg airport. This is back pre-World War I. And they're able to land jets on the airstrips that he designed today. And we were talking about aviation being like 2 years old at the time. And this guy had that kind of a vision and precision about his mathematical work. And what he did was observe effects in the trenches in World War I of bombings and shellings taking place. The commanders would get up and give the order to charge, and these guys were in trenches. And as soon as you stick your head out of the trench, you get killed, right? So the commanders would jump up and say, everybody charge, and everybody would just sit there. For months, everybody would just sit there. And then all of a sudden, there'd be no command, but some guy would light a cigarette, or there'd be a pot shot at somebody else, and all of a sudden, all hell would break loose, and there'd be this huge battle, and thousands of people would get killed. And Witte observed this, and he started clocking the times that all this happened. And he expected to find very hard astrological aspects occurring at these times, and they weren't there. So he said, oh, there must be other planets out there causing all this. So based on his empirical research of events taking place, he began to try to figure out what these planets were and how they worked and what their orbits were and so forth. That's how all this got started. But Cupido and Hades, the innermost, have very well-defined elliptical orbits. The others are very strange because their orbits are almost perfectly circular. That's an anomaly in the solar system, right? We know that everything travels around the sun in big ellipses, right? Not quite right. Some of the latest research suggests that perhaps the TNPs, the trans-Neptunians, are objects in what we call the Kuiper belt. This little green ring in the middle, can you see that there? Okay. That's the orbit of Jupiter around the sun, which is the tiny dot in the middle. You need your specs for this one. It's a little tiny thing there, and around the beginning of the red area here is the orbit of Pluto. Okay? To give you a sense of perspective, Neptune and Pluto are out in the red rings, and the Kuiper belt is this area of blue right around there. It's a band of planetary activity that has been discovered with some of our space telescopes and stuff like that. Okay. Now, last summer at Caltech, Michael Brown and Chadwick Trujillo sighted and measured a Kuiper belt object that they called Quawar, named after some South American deity. Quawar is kind of funny. It's about 800 miles in diameter. That's about 4 billion miles away from Earth, roughly a billion farther out than Pluto. Now, it's unusual, Quawar is, because it has an orbit that's almost perfectly circular. It's not an elliptical orbit. And its orbit, in fact, corresponds quite closely to the proposed orbit of the trans-Neptunian Kronos. So we may, in fact, have sighted and mapped one of the actual trans-Neptunians that was hypothesized 100 years before by Witte. Now, I'm sure you have heard in early March the announcement that a new planet had been discovered. Remember Sedna? That was announced in March. It was actually sighted on November 14th of last year. And these are the first photographs of the planet Sedna. Of course, they immediately had to fly out an artist to draw it. And there that is. Okay. It's even further out than Quaoar. Now, Sedna is probably not one of the trans-Neptunian planets. Now, we'll just spend a moment with Sedna here and explain why that's the case. This is our solar system here. In this case, the orange ring is the orbit of Jupiter. We have the asteroid belt, and then inside it, Mars, Earth, and so forth, and the sun in the middle. And this shrinks down to this scale in this diagram. Out here is the Kuiper belt. That's K-U-I-P-E-R, Kuiper belt, that we were talking about. And this is where Quaoar has been sighted. And we go from that to here, and this long elliptical orbit is the orbit of Sedna they're proposing, compared to the rest of the solar system. So to say that we found a new planet orbiting the sun, and this is the whole thing in perspective of this outer galactic realm there. This has an orbit of 10,500 years, Sedna does. So in terms of its relevance to trading, I'm not sure. Unless you've got long-term contracts. Yeah, okay. Okay. So Sedna's out there. This is where you would see it in the sky, if you could see it, which you can't, not even with a telescope. So the astronomers right now are talking about things that you can't see that are probably out there that have these long orbits, and this is what science is doing now. But it's not the trans-Neptunians, our old friends. So I look at these every week in my newsletter, the Financial Cycles weekly update, as well as the regular planets, because I'm interested in trying to determine what impact they do have on the markets. And thanks to some good help from Carlos, we got them added to the Galactic Trader program. You can get the planetary lines for the trans-Neptunians as of last October, November. And I've done some pretty interesting work with them there. Now, they do not come up under your aspectarian when you right-click on a price bar. It won't tell you anything about the trans-Neptunians. The galactic clock module in the program does not include the trans-Neptunians. Just the planetary lines are there, okay? So they're not integrated into all the features in the program. And about twice a month, I'm on the phone to Carlos saying, hey, when are we going to get around to that? Because I'm eager to see them work through the whole thing. Question, yeah.
As I look on my fingers, it strikes me about the symbols, the combination of symbols that we have now.
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be work done on it like that if they're really cycle points made where, I mean, I think this has an 8-year cycle where it's that years or 20 years where it was years ago. To do that cycle, it moves around. So somehow at least
What we're dealing with here, are very long-term cycles. I mean, not like Sedna, 10,500 years. Pluto, remember, has an orbit of 248 years, roughly, okay? And the next nearest in is Cupido, which is farther out than Pluto, almost 300 years in duration. Hades is right at 365 years in duration. So if you're interested in progressed horoscopes, Hades is going to move to the same position every year. That's a real interesting phenomenon, okay? But that's another story. All the way out to Poseidon, which has an orbital period of about 800 years. So from 200 to 800 years ballpark is what we're talking about here. Now, we don't get a lot of action with these. It was interesting, though, to me, because I was writing about them and trying to understand the symbolism, trying to understand their implications. How do they work in and out of the markets? I'm experimenting with it. Last summer, I wrote in my letter, June 19th, the trans-Neptunian hypothetical planet Zeus is associated with warfare, armaments, and physical compulsion. It's making a planetary station just hours before an explosive Mars-Uranus meeting on June 20th, which makes for an extremely treacherous situation. It's likely we'll have to contend with catastrophes or geopolitical disturbances. Make a little astrological forecast, throw that out there, see what happens, all right? Now, this was June 20th of last summer, okay? a Zeus station. Now, as it turned out, there was a train derailment that day near Los Angeles, which flattened 3 homes and sent more than a dozen people to the hospital. Wildfires swept through Arizona, burning hundreds of thousands of acres, destroying homes. The Israelis and Palestinians had some more killings and counter-killings, all in the name of peace. A truck bomb blew up in Chechnya near a secret police headquarters and killed several people. And more than 200 people lost their lives in a sinking of a boat off the coast of Tunisia. A normal news day, okay? Not a whole lot unusual, although there was certainly catastrophe and violence associated. Now, I happened to be in Birmingham, Alabama that week. Anybody from Alabama here? Good, we can talk about Alabama. The front page of the Birmingham Post-Herald caught my eye. "Hail Vulcan," it said. Now, you've got to remember, this is the state where they had this thing about displaying the 10 Commandments in the courthouse. So this caught my eye. Wait a minute, why do we have a pagan deity on the front page of the newspaper with this headline of the Birmingham Post-Herald? It was a little bit unusual. But then I realized that this was a huge statue of Vulcan. Birmingham is a steel town, and they got this mountain outside the town, and this is kind of the local mascot. And they've been doing restoration work on the statue for 4 years. And they were just finishing up that job, and it had been completed the day before on the 20th of June. Now, I thought this would have been really appropriate if it had been a Vulcanus station instead of a Zeus station, right? Until I realized the details of the event. I went to the inside page of the paper and looked at the story there, and they attached the day before, on the date of the Zeus station, Vulcan's right arm and the big spear he was holding. Zeus is about big weaponry, okay? So this was literally a big weapon, and it was attached to the statue at the exact moment of the Zeus planetary station. This was of interest to nobody in Birmingham but me, but I had fun with it. I thought, oh, this is weird, you know. So it's little things like that had me looking at this stuff, okay? Now, here's a graphic ephemeris. What about the hypotheticals in the markets? These are the trans-Neptunians from the years 1780 to 2030. This is a 360 degree modulus, so we can see how they move through the zodiac. And over this period of time, you can see the crossing points between the planets. This, I think, answers your question about their orbital periods and whatnot. I mean, these little, where's my pointer thing there? These are decades here. This is like during the 1980s, the 90s, So we get a cluster of them occurring during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s in terms of exact conjunctions of these planets, but most of the time they're off doing their own thing out in space there. Not much is happening. So if we're trying to use planetary aspects between just the trans-Neptunians to determine trading opportunities, we better be in long-term something, right? However, we can add to this, the same graph, some horizontal lines, and these lines represent the planetary positions for the planets in the stock market horoscope, the natal chart for the New York Stock Exchange. And notice that a lot of these conjunctions that are occurring between these planets are also hitting right on lines. This is a Mars line for the stock exchange, and I'm having trouble reading it up here. Admetos and Cupido meeting right there at that particular time. So they're impacting the stock exchange chart in some fairly dramatic ways over the long-term history. Right, these are very slow moving. This is kind of like background noise. Yeah, Eric?
I tell you what, I'm pretty amazed. I just put on a Hades 24 and a Cupido 24.
Cupido, yeah.
Well, the Hades nailed the low in September of 2002. Cupido, it came right to that on the retest, that nailed the low. And it's just bouncing. I mean,
It's interesting when you start to look at these guys, okay? Now, this is a close-up shot here. This is just the 20th century, okay? Plus this current decade here tagged on the end, okay?
We're talking about the strength of that circle. Those lines should be permanent.
They are virtually horizontal lines. Okay, that's an important thing. So they're setting up these long-term standing waves, and we're going to look at the way they operate here. Let's take a look at the US dollar index. Now here we've added lines for all the outer planets and the trans-Neptunians, and we got lots of points of contact. There's no Mars, Venus, or whatever here, all right? Now if we keep adding planetary lines, we can prove anything. Just keep throwing up more lines there. So what we want to do is take out some of the noise. Let's go down to two trans-Neptunian hypotheticals, Kronos and Apollon. And all of a sudden we can begin to see how the dollar responds long term to these planetary lines. Now what we're doing with all these examples until we get to individual charts are lines set heliocentrically, 24, not mirrored, 0 factor. You straight default on the program. Just punch in the line and this is what happens. Okay? What about the DAX? Here is the DAX in Germany and the trans-Neptunian Zeus. Fairly long-term chart. We've got from 1998 to 2002, 4 or 5 year period on this chart. But we have to start looking at the longer time frames to see, how does this stuff work. And when the harmonic action of a single planet precisely marks reversal points in a market in the course of a single year, this is a shorter time frame for the DAX, just from the summer of 2001 to summer 2002. We've got it hitting the Zeus line 10 times in the course of 1 year. I think it's worth paying attention to. Weird stuff, eh? So let's look at the Dow. In this case, we're looking at a longer time frame, again a little over 4 years. So there are not quite as many reversal points involved in this particular one, but we're interested here in one hypothetical planet, Poseidon, that outermost one. Poseidon and the Dow. This is again heliocentric line in the 24th harmonic. Let's drop in the geocentric line. You can see how the geocentric orbit makes a little bit of a sine wave, even though it's real laid back there. Okay? And notice that when we put in the geocentric blue line for Poseidon here, it picks up more points exactly with the reversals. Like right over here, notice that it turns on the geocentric line. Down here, it comes down to the geocentric line, and so forth. So that, it's not determining all the movement of the stock, or of the Dow, obviously, but it's doing something significant. And in this case, it seemed to me that the geocentric was a little more important than the heliocentric. Here's another time frame. Still looking at just the same planetary line, just Poseidon, during a different 4-year period in the history of the Dow. And it's defined a trading range moving up and down long term within the bounds of the Poseidon line. Then we move up to the early 70s when the bear market began to growl. And we have that whole move defined by Poseidon. It defined the trading range of the bear market in the Dow in the early 70s. See, we started with some fairly far out stuff, and all of a sudden it begins to look real when we look at it in work. Now let's add a couple of outer planets to this same price chart. This is Jupiter through Pluto, we've dropped in here, plus Chiron, which is also available on the program. Chiron's a comet that's fairly significant. And Jupiter and Pluto do a good job of defining the trend lines, but none of these, we put in all these outer planets here, none of them are defining the bounds of the move of the Dow the way that Poseidon is doing. And that's the point of this. We've got something that's doing something different in our long-term charts. The trans-Neptunians do function, and they function in a different way. And what happens here, let's kick out the ones that aren't relevant in this chart. Okay, get rid of a few of them. The blue lines going up are heliocentric Jupiter, and this is the lunar node, the squiggly brown lines going down. Lunar node's always in retrograde motion, right? The true node. The red lines again, heliocentric Poseidon. So the lunar node took the bear market down. Okay? Rode that node line all the way down. Jupiter brought it back up. But how far it went was determined by Poseidon.
Wasn't there a particular node aspect to it, top and bottom?
I believe so. Now, Poseidon's impact on the Dow didn't stop at the end of the 70s. Here's the first half of the 1980s. Again, same heliocentric line, same harmonics. We can just see, where it hits the points on this. And understand that this behaves just like a normal technical indicator. Okay? The resistance that's set up over here becomes the support zone. It tests this resistance, it breaks through it, and then that becomes support. I mean, we're looking for things that act in very real ways, just like other technical indicators. And that's important to understand here. This is not some la-la stuff. Okay? And here, resistance. We bounce off that line a couple times before it breaks through, and it finds support there before the big move up, right on the Poseidon line. Now here's a part of that period we just looked at, this earlier example of resistance and support. And again, what we've done is put in the geocentric line. And isn't that interesting? Because things are really stopping on the geocentric line and not the heliocentric one. So the heliocentric enables us to look at it long term quickly, and we get pretty straightforward results and say, is this something worth looking at? And then we zoom in and say, okay, let's fine tune it with the geocentric. And that's the way I use this stuff. Now sometimes when we first glance at planetary lines, we say, oh well, that didn't hold, look at this. Except for the fact here, the exact close of this line, we can't see it because it's covered up with the red Poseidon line. The exact open on this day's trading over here was exactly on that Poseidon line. Okay? That's right. It didn't close below it. Didn't penetrate it at all. Intraday, yeah. Okay, we got all this flack in there. So you got to be careful how you look at your price bars when you start doing this kind of work. You start looking at long range charts. And then again, same thing happening here at the high in January with the Dow, January of 90. The opening and closing right on the Poseidon line, even though intraday we get a little bit of penetration. Now at the start of 91, the Dow gapped upward to trade at the next highest level of the Poseidon line. Like this. And it found some support, or rather over here, okay, and it found support there, and then it moves up. See this gap here is what we're talking about. I should have put an arrow on there. So it gapped up all the way to the Poseidon line, moved right up to the next one, found support at this level, and then moved up again on the Poseidon line. Right, the bombing of Baghdad. Later in the 90s, we have a similar situation. Poseidon repeatedly telling us how far the market moves. These are all the places where we hit the Poseidon line during this time frame. Again, just looking at the Dow, just looking at heliocentric Poseidon, one line, one increment, that's all. Just want to see, does this have any validity or not? So how's it been doing a little more recently? Last year, for example. A few turning points. And here what I've done is put the heliocentric and geocentric together. So when you start looking at a longer range, you can see the blue and red lines kind of blur together. You have to zoom in closer to get the difference in the detail there. But how about more than a dozen reversal points on this one planetary line in the course of a 10-month period? Is that worth looking at? Even though the planet doesn't exist? Then a little bit more recently. This is a fun example. Earlier this year, Poseidon line, again, defining support for the Dow, February and early March, heliocentric and geocentric increments of the lines, where they were vis-a-vis the Dow. And then we get this warning sign. The Dow closed below the Poseidon line for the first time on March 8th. What were your indicators doing on March 8th? What were they showing you was coming? Poseidon says, watch out. This is unusual. Okay? It's worth taking a look at. Check your technical indicators. Again, we're not going to trade on this one thing alone on the planetary line, but it says, pay attention here. The Dow has just closed below Poseidon. Something is afoot, as they say, like a big move down. Poseidon support broke, and the Dow went down until mid-March and began to trade in a range below a lower increment of the Poseidon line. So Poseidon and the Dow, worth playing with, worth looking at. It bounced off that line then, stayed in a channel between those lines for a while. It's a tough market to trade. So the Trans-Neptunians work. So what we need to do is figure out how they function in first trade charts, as Mr. Bayer suggested. Do they have anything to do with them? So let's take a look at another horoscope here. In this case, we can't look at it on the chart from the first trade chart in the program because it doesn't include the Trans-Neptunians. We have to calculate it with other software if we want them to show up in a horoscope. This is a stock of an oil company, Pogo producing, symbol PPP, NYSE, I believe. And here we have the current chart for the opening bell yesterday. The outer planets stuck around the outside. There's some interesting things that are going on with this chart, most notably the fact that transiting Jupiter in the sky is getting ready to conjoin Saturn over here in the first trade chart. That's coming up pretty rapidly here. And so it says to us that Saturn might be worth paying attention to. Something's going on with that. Okay? So we want to take a look at Saturn in the chart. The other thing we would note here as we examine this chart is that we've got Vulcanus, the Trans-Neptunian, pretty near an angle in the chart, so that's going to take on some significance as well. It's the closest planet to an angle right over here. And we probably ought to be taking a look at the Vulcanus line as well. So let's start with Saturn. Here is the price bars for the chart, and we've got the Saturn 24 helio, our normal Saturn line. There's definitely something going on here that seems to track things pretty well. Obviously I'm not going to be trading on the basis of that line alone. So let's do my favorite trick. We'll superimpose a geocentric line over the heliocentric one for the same planet, and we can see, okay, this is hitting a lot better here. It's picking up more of the lows. It's defining some potential turning points a little bit better. We may be interested in Saturn here, so we'll get rid of the heliocentric line and just look at the geocentric one and see it a little bit more clearly. Again, when you start to work with planetary lines, in my way of working with them, you get rid of them when you discover they're not working for you. You don't hang on to them in the chart because we want minimal amount of information so it starts to make sense. Then if we've got it down to 1 or 2 or 3 things, we can develop trading rules and put them into a trading plan that says, when it does this, I do that. Otherwise, this is all mush. Okay? And so is your bank account, by the time you get through. Okay. Now, this is an interesting concept. Let's take this position of Saturn at 12 degrees of Virgo. Remember, Virgo is 150. And we'll round up the 42 degrees to 3/4 of a degree. So we're going to call this 162.75. That decimalized degree equivalent that we talked about at the beginning. What happens, we're going to move the decimal point over to 16.275. And let's put in a Saturn line on this chart corresponding to this first trade position. And this is kind of a leap of faith, if you will. Because what we're going to do is divide the 360-degree wheel by 16.275. not by 90, not by 24. We're going to divide it by a degree position that corresponds to the natal position of the planet itself in the first trade chart. Does this have any significance? Does it do anything for us? We'll leave up the old Saturn line, the geocentric Saturn. And in this case, we've got the new line added, which starts to, the blue line here is the one corresponding to the first trade chart. And notice how much closer it hits some of these points. Both of them are working to some degree, but it's giving us some interesting action with that particular line. It's reaching toward the turning points in the chart a little bit more. So I'm going to leave that line in the chart as significance. It matches more of the turning points, and we've highlighted those with arrows there, the little dark red arrows, all the places where it hits along that line. Now we'll get rid of the Saturn 24 line. This is just the natal Saturn line, if you will, calibrated for 16.275. And then we're going to go back to our first trade chart and drop in the lines for Vulcanus. Again, using the position of Vulcanus from the first trade chart. 9 degrees, 20 minutes of Cancer in the first trade chart, so we translate that to a factor of 99.3. And because Vulcanus moves so slowly, the lines are almost totally horizontal, but we notice immediately that interesting things happen around this line, like this gap over here, in the places where the price actually does get close to it. Okay. Now, there's one other thing about this first trade chart, the chart for Pogo producing. Jupiter in that chart does not appear to be particularly significant, but the fact is Jupiter made a retrograde station on November 25th, 1978, about a week after the date of that first trade chart. So Jupiter was moving very slowly at the time. It's not apparent to a first glance of the chart, but it's very, very important in terms of analyzing the chart correctly. And we'll add a Jupiter line here at 12.89 geocentric to help define the support and the resistance with this particular chart. Let's zoom in a little bit there. We can see that blue line, darker blue line for Jupiter a little more clearly and get a little bit closer there. You can see how these lines derive from the planetary positions of the first trade chart. Okay? Here are the points that the Jupiter line interacts with the chart, and the crossing points of Jupiter and Saturn, the exact aspects of Jupiter and Saturn, are also important. We've circled those in defining the price movement here, and of course we don't want to forget Vulcanus and the little green boxes as well. Okay? So how do you keep up with all this stuff? We're going to look at one more example and we're going to knock off here, because this is getting intense. Okay? Well, how you keep up with it is my job. This is what you get in the Financial Cycles weekly updates. Every week I'll talk about anywhere from 3 to 6 stocks that I'm looking at and studying as possible candidates for a trade. And for example, this was April 18th issue. We talked about Corinthian colleges. We'll give the first trade date so you can set up your own chart if you don't already happen to have it in the program. We talk about what planetary lines I'm looking at, where I set things on the galactic trader so that you can look at it and make your own choices. Not recommending a trade, saying this is what I'm planning to do. This is the way I analyze it. If you see it differently, please argue with me. Keep me safe. Yeah.
How do you scan the chart?
Yeah, well, let's take a look at, it's a complex process, and I'm constantly sifting things. This is the first trade chart for COCO, Corinthian colleges. And, this is what caught my eye about this chart. 2 things in particular. First of all, we've got Saturn transiting across the IC, right at the bottom of the chart here. Okay? That is a major flag. Saturn tends to bring prices down, to level them out. If the stock has been shooting up with great velocity, it will turn it down. Okay? If it's been churning along, it's going to create a bottom from which it can spring. Okay?
What would you choose that chart in the first place? Is it like tick? You have a scan method or?
Well, I scan, current planetary positions versus a database of first trade charts sorted by planetary positions in that.
The software that does that.
We've got Galactic Stock Trader, which has many of these programs of these charts in there. But I have collected my own database and supplemented it over the years and keep refining and adding to it. Okay?
That's different from Galactic.
Right, it's different than Galactic Trader. And you can also match that to natal planetary positions. And I think Ted will be talking about that as well. Yeah?
Do you use sector?
Sector analysis. I do some sector analysis as part of the scan as well. And I have a set of fundamental parameters that I screen for. I mean, that's another whole lecture about all the screening procedures that I use. Okay? So and I'm not trying to be evasive about it, but it's a very systematic methodology. Yeah. Yes, if you coordinate them with Fibonacci analysis. In other words, you could do Fibonacci bands for time projections as well. Okay? Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And I'm not trying to graph that out with this program. I mean, that's a real strong concept you've latched onto. Possibly, and I'd like an opportunity to discuss that with you, individually, because it's there's some real interesting areas to explore, and then I'm trying to coordinate some of this to planetary positions for Fibonacci numbers, and there are other things that are coming out of this work. This is stuff I've been developing over the last 6 months.
Real quick, I'll make a commercial for you, because I know you're a humble guy and you want them. People that don't know a lot about astrology, Tim's got a complete course. There's a yellow box out there where he just starts with soup to nuts and goes all the way through with the trading plan and everything else. So that's great.
Thank you, Eric. I'll pay you later. That's good. But no, that's part of what I consider my mission, is to be able to help people get their feet wet in this area and keep their money safe while they do so, and maintain some level of sanity about all this loony stuff that we deal with here.
I'll take two.
You take two. Go ahead. Sign him up. Yeah, Frank.
Sorry, in your example, the only thing I missed was I knew you did Saturn based on its natal placement of 162.70.
Right.
Had it set at 16.275. Is that the same thing you did with Jupiter? You did it
Jupiter, took the natal placement, but it was significant because there was a planetary station of Jupiter near the first trade date. Okay. Right. Yeah. Let's run through this one more example, then we can get everybody fed and watered and move on to the next thing here. I don't want to chew up too much of Ted's time, but these are some of the things we looked at here. First of all, Saturn on the IC in the chart transiting Neptune is getting ready to conjoin the first trade Sun as well. This says to me, be suspicious of this stock. Okay? It says to me, we might have a potential candidate for a short if the chart bears it out. We've not looked at the chart yet. Also, we note, and this is what I'm saying in the newsletter here, I'm looking at transiting Neptune, conjoining the Sun, Saturn getting ready to cross the first trade IC. This has us setting up for a possible short. Also, in the first trade chart, one thing that catches our eye is a tight planetary conjunction. This is another thing I found that's significant. Chiron and Capito, 2.5 and 3 degrees of Sagittarius. These guys operate together, and we translate those positions this way, 24.32, 24.25 for our settings on Galactic Trader. Now, let's look at some price bars here. Let's get back to the markets after all. Okay. What do we have up here now? This would be, this is Chiron and Capito, the ones we were just talking about. Chiron is the red line. I love to play with the colors and all this stuff. It's just, we did black for the oil company. This is green for education, you know, whatever. That's the cool thing about this program. You can monkey with the settings a lot. And we can see that we're getting some potential turning points. But what I'm interested in right here, okay, is this stock going to continue to back off here or not? This is a pretty sensitive zone that's getting defined here. And notice as well in the letter we say we're going to set an initial stop. If we go short at $35, we plan to trade it in the coming week. Okay, so that's where our stop level will go, is right above this line in this case. If it penetrates these lines, we know it's going to be on the way up. And that's how we kind of ballpark it. So our plan then is to sell this midweek, but we're going to wait for the aspects to tighten up a little bit here, because we've got this aspect between Chiron and Capito forming. And we want to get past the solar eclipse. This went on the 18th, the day before a solar eclipse on the 19th of April. And then on Wednesday of that week, there was a void of course moon all day. That too is another lecture, but that's a good day to stay out of the market in terms of the way that I work it. So I was looking at Thursday, April 22nd then as the potential date for putting on the trade. So let's look at what happened. On Monday, the trading bar was an inside bar with a higher close. We were hoping for a little bit more of a price rise to set up the short than that, but you know, that was okay. And on Tuesday, the day after the eclipse, we had a lot more volatility, a big daily bar there. Now, we have a close that was a lot lower, and we're thinking maybe should have gone ahead with the short early in the week instead of sticking with our trading plan and waiting for an entry point on Thursday. But notice that the close of the bar was right on the Capito line, or the low of the bar, rather, intraday low. Big confirmation that these lines are working. So the question is it going to bounce back or not? The next day, void of course moon all day, so we need to take the next day's action with a grain of salt. In other words, it's going to tell us something that may be false. It's going to fake us out, potentially. And sure enough, the next day, we get this bar. And I'm real glad I didn't short it earlier in the week, because it would have taken me out above my stop intraday. And it closed at $34.99, 1 penny under where I was planning to put the stop. This is looking a little bit scary, but I'm going to stick with the trading plan and enter the trade on Thursday. So we shorted Corinthian Colleges on Thursday. We put in a stop at $37 instead of our plan $35, because it was already trading through our stop. We want to give it a little bit of room to breathe. We just kind of ballparked that one, saying, okay, initially I'm going to do that, then I'm going to tweak the stop after the fact. The daily low on this bar, let's see. Did I not get? Okay. So we shorted it there. Let's go here. There we go. And then what we do here at the end of the week is lower the buy stop down to $36.25 after it's come along. Okay. Then Monday, last week, an interesting thing happened. It closed below the Capito line. See the close below the blue line. Big confirmation for our short. It felt good to have been in at a higher price here and to come down a little bit. But we had to break through the Chiron line as well. Tuesday of last week, that's what happened. It broke the Chiron line. Nothing real emphatic here. If you're not watching these particular planetary lines, it's not going to tell you a whole lot. So that's what happened on Tuesday. Maybe this was going to work out as a short. Right? Wednesday's trade, kaboom.
Wow.
Do these lines work? Yeah. So that was Wednesday. Then the last 2 days of the week, last week, kept us in the trading range, concealed by these lines. We moved our stop again at the end of the week, locking in profits right now. And that's where we stood as of yesterday. Now here, we could have moved the buy stop back above this line here. But my feeling is that if it moves back above that line, it's going to really take off strongly. So I've set the stop instead at 31.95. I want to lock in the profits and get greedy, okay, on that one. So there we have our adventure in advanced planetary trading. This is wild territory. We have to finish with one more Nasrudin story. At the end of the road, right? At the end of his life, Nasrudin goes to heaven. And he's greeted at the pearly gates by an angel with a flaming sword. He says, "Who are you and what do you want?" Nasrudin says, "I am Mullah Nasrudin, the scholar. I've come to enter heaven. I've lived a good life and I should go in here." The angel says, "Well, how do I know you're really Mullah Nasrudin?" Nasrudin looks at him and says, "How do I know you're an angel? For that matter, how do I know this is actually the gates of heaven? Can you prove it to me?" And about that time a voice echoes forth from inside the pearly gates saying, "Go ahead and let him in. He's one of us." So I hope you're one of us by now. We got any tape left, Seth? A couple minutes. 2 minutes worth of questions before the tape runs out. Yeah.
Is the name of the game really then finding the right lines for the chart? That's based on the Astro-Soft, right?
Yeah, using the first trade chart to determine which planets to look at, and then looking at them empirically to see what works with the trading history for that stock. You know, what we're doing here is providing something intermediate. Instead of saying, hey, I've got all these different lines I can throw up there, which ones do I use? What settings do I use? Do I mirror them or not? How do I make it all make sense? And we can do one of two things. We can look at what's going on in the sky. There's a conjunction between Mars and Jupiter. What does that mean? And we can set that up with the planetary lines on the chart, right? Or we can look at the first trade chart for the entity that we're trading and say, what do the planets look like there? And use that as a guide to identify the lines that may be most relevant for us. Each horoscope, each first trade chart has its own imprint and its own energy and value. And so that's what determines the relevance of certain lines. We put them up, but then we go back and test them empirically. Does this work or not? Unfortunately, and one of our biggest needs in this field is an easier to use, more rigorous system for back testing planetary factors. We're struggling in that area. You know? It's one thing to say, I'll buy a stock if it breaks through a 50-day moving average. We can calculate that and it will always be the same. But to say, I'll buy a stock if it breaks through a Jupiter line, or when it breaks through the line of the planet nearest the ascendant in this first trade, it gets pretty complicated. It can be done, I'm confident. But there's a whole other level of complexity behind that. That's what makes the trans-Neptunian lines so cool, because they move so little. Because they're so level. Either they're working or they're not working. There's no speculation, no guesswork around it. Very, very hard-nosed stuff here, despite the fact that they don't exist. Yeah, Baja.
But
Well, thank you.
taught me that the things you look at would be like planets conjunct, when you're looking at that first grade, right? Planets conjuncting the angles,
Right.
planets that are aspecting the sun,
Possibly, yeah.
possibly,
Okay.
and then planets that are receiving important transit.
Right. If a planet is taking an important transit from another planet in the sky now, that's worth looking at. If a planet is on an angle of a first trade chart, that's worth looking at. If there's a tight conjunction between planets in a first trade chart, that's an important one you don't want to miss, because they will often be active. And typically what happens is only one of the two is active in the actual stock chart, in the trading chart. Okay. So we might have a conjunction of Chiron and Venus in a chart, and you bring it up there, and Chiron works and Venus doesn't. And I don't know why, but that again is part of that empirical testing of it. You know. Okay.
Do you use IBD or boundary line or?
I read IBD. Don't agree with their politics, so it gets my my blood pressure up, and I'm ready to go to work, and it's good.
When you're checking the stock attitude, use IBD.
Yeah, I have fundamental screens that I put in place as well, and I use a number of tools to do that. Yeah.